Week we speak to Leith Van Onselen. He's one of the movers and shakers and groovers, dare I say, at macrobusiness.com.au. We go there for our economic and finance news every day. It's excellent. And he's on the line, Mr. Van Onselen. Good morning. I hope you're well, mate.
Yeah, I am, Luke. How about yourself?
Doing just fine, Leith, doing just fine. We've had a few things this week. The first off is, and to my knowledge, you've been speaking about this per capita recession longer than just about anyone else, and we've had the national accounts come out through the week, and our GDP as a country rose by 0.2. That's 0.2% in the second quarter. So we're growing at about a percent a year, and you have to go back a long way, mate, don't you, to get growth like that?
Yeah, basically, so the overall Australian economy, so that's all the economic activity in the economy, basically grew at its slowest rate since the early 90s recession, December 1991, so it's a pretty poor figure. But it's a particularly poor figure when you adjust for population growth. So everyone who's listening to this knows that Australia's population has been growing like a science experiment through extreme immigration. And, we grew by 2.4% last year, which is close to a record, close to the highest level since the early 1950s. It's down slightly from the peak last year. But what it basically meant, Luke, is that we had another quarter of declining per capita GDP. So what that means is that everybody's slice of the pie continues to shrink, and it fell by 0.4% in Q2, and it's actually fallen for 6 straight quarters to be down by 2% per capita GDP since the Albanese government was elected in the June quarter of 2022. So it's a pretty bad thing, but what makes it particularly bad is it's a breakup of the growth, Luke. The public sector grew by 1.5% in the second quarter, whereas the private sector declined by 0.6%. So effectively, the economy's been held up by two things. That's obviously the extreme population growth we've got, but also massive government spending, whereas the private sector is going backwards at a rate of knots. And in particular, the thing that we all care the most about is the household sector. So the economy's split up into 3 areas: households, government, businesses. Households the biggest one. That's where you and I and everyone who's listening lives. That's what we care about. And household consumption, which is real spending by households per capita, has fallen for 6 straight quarters, down about 2.4%. But the real bad one, Luke, is that real per capita household disposable income's fallen by just over 8% over 2 years, which is basically a world record decline. So, the household sector's getting absolutely hammered. And it's a pretty, soft economy we've got here, obviously. And it's actually the longest per capita recession in modern history. It's not the deepest, but it's the longest. So it's a long grind downwards.
That's extraordinary. So real per capita household disposable income has fallen about 8% from over what
for 2
period?
years?
2 years.
Over 8 quarters from June 2022 peak.
So when you've got the Treasurer and others saying, oh, look at this, we've increased wages by 15% in this sector or that sector, and they talk about, real income advancing, that's not right, is it?
No.
It's not right.
It's complete, joke, basically. Yeah. So once you strip out population growth, you strip out inflation, it's absolutely hammered. So real wages are down by about 7% from their peak, but real per capita household disposable income, which also factors in other costs like rising mortgage payments and those sorts of things, has actually fallen by even more. It also factors in increasing tax payments.
Jeez. So we saw the Treasurer and his mentor on the Today Show yesterday trying to give it to the Reserve Bank. Are they right to do that, or is this a sign of something more sinister?
No, honestly, I think they're just basically panicking. So, the Reserve Bank's rate hikes are doing what they're supposed to do, right? They're smashing the private sector, which is what they're meant to do. We've got this elevated inflation, but one of the reasons why I've got the elevated inflation is because of the federal government. So, one, it's running an extreme immigration policy that's obviously pushing up rents and housing inflation, which is, housing inflation is the single biggest component of the CPI basket. And then it's also obviously, this huge government spending is propping up demand. So the Reserve Bank's trying to slow demand. So obviously it's going to squeeze the private sector harder. So, and I think the reason why Labor's doing it is because Labor and the coalition are neck and neck in the polls, and the hung parliament's looking likely if an election was held today. And the Albanese government's been trying to, spruik about the cost of living. Labor's trying to ease the cost of living, but Some polling that came out this week by Redbridge Polling Group showed that only 24% of those surveyed stated that they can name a single thing that the Albanese government's done that's made their life better, which means that 3/4 of Aussies aren't falling for it. And I think Labor knows that if the RBA doesn't cut rates in the first half of next year, it's going to be in deep political trouble, could potentially be a one-term government. And across the pond in New Zealand, the Reserve Bank of New Zealand cut interest rates last month unexpectedly. It's also flagged further rate cuts. And now the incumbent national government over there has experienced a strong bounce in the polls. Consumer sentiment's lifted. Government confidence has increased. So I think, Labor knows that basically its road back into government relies on the RBA cutting rates.
Yeah. Look, I'm sure it'll give people hope, and there are lots of people right on the edge that just want some hope. But, 12 rises under this government, I can't see one cut saving the day necessarily. As I say, it will give some people hope. But do you really think at the back of all of this and having to deal with this crisis for so long, Australians are saying, oh, well, I've had my interest rate reduced by 0.25%, I better vote this bloke in again? Do you really think that'll happen?
Yeah, but I mean, generally cuts don't happen just as a single cut. So once they start cutting, there'll be more to follow. And I think once we hit the peak and everyone knows that we're past the worst of it, maybe, it should lift sentiment at least, and it should improve the government standing. So we'll have to wait and see. But definitely, Jim Chalmers, I think him saying, attacking the Reserve Bank and saying that smashing the economy is an acknowledgement that they're very concerned about this and that they desperately want the RBA to cut rates to take pressure off them.
Yeah. Now let's get to this energy story, which is just extraordinary. We have now an appetite for importing gas. Yes, listeners, I know we're, I think, the second greatest exporter of gas on the planet. We might still be at number one, but we are now set to import gas. This has got to be a G-up, doesn't it?
Yeah, mate. Can you imagine a Middle Eastern country importing oil?
Petrol,
That's
exactly.
basically what Australia's, it's moronic. So,
yeah.
So just a quick refresh. I know I've talked about this before, but East Coast Australia exports over 70% of its gas. So we sell it offshore. We sell it predominantly to China and Japan, who we actually give more gas to than they need, and then they re-export it for profit. And we've got them on cheap long-term contracts. Meanwhile, at home, we're paying, as of Friday, about $12 a gigajoule for our gas on the East Coast, which is about 3 to 4 times what Americans pay, who are the biggest gas exporter in the world. It's completely idiotic. And instead of reserving gas for domestic use and clawing back some of that gas from China and Japan, which they do not need because they're getting too much, and implementing domestic reservation policy, capping prices at a reasonable level that's a little bit above the cost of extraction, so that, the businesses in that space can earn a reasonable return, but not an insane return they're getting at the moment. There's now talk of us now building import terminals. And the reason that's been put for this is because the north-south pipeline that runs from Queensland to Victoria runs above capacity or at capacity during the winter months. So basically in the winter months, Melbourne's really cold. We use a lot of gas heating. And as a result, our demand for gas is more than can be supplied through the north-south pipeline. So the solution now is, we can't, the pipeline doesn't supply enough gas. We better do this LNG exports. It's completely stupid because the optimal solution is to build a few storage tanks. We already have one in Victoria. Europe, the USA, all these other places around the world, they all build storage tanks. They fill them during the summer months when they don't need as much gas at cheaper prices. And then they draw down on them in the winter months when demand's high. But instead of doing the simple thing, which might cost maybe a couple $100 million to build these storage tanks, which isn't that much money in the scheme of things, the solution now is to import gas from overseas into an East Coast market that exports over 70% of its gas to China and Japan and gives more gas away than our customers actually need. It is idiotic policy. And unfortunately, just Squadron Energy, which is owned by, net zero evangelist and iron ore miner Andrew Forrest, is building a $1 billion terminal to import LNG in New South Wales at Port Kembla. And they're now demanding that state and federal governments basically guarantee purchases of this imported LNG and become the, quote, buyer of last resort. So what this basically means is that taxpayers are going to effectively guarantee that we're going to buy, a certain quantity of this expensive imported gas, which is going to cost us money. And what it's basically going to do is it's going to peg the East Coast gas prices at a forever high international level. Goodness. Instead of doing the simple thing, which is working in our interest, reserving the gas like Western Australia, the United States, every other gas exporting place in the world does, having a low price for domestic customers, and if needed, just build a few storage facilities to see us through those winter months. It's not rocket science. The solutions are there. It's what every other country does, that Europe, America, etc. And for some reason, our politicians cannot get this right.
Yeah. It's amazing. Lee, thanks a lot, mate. I'll talk to you next week. Brilliant today, all that stuff. So very useful to know. Thanks so much. Leith Van Ontelen, macrobusiness.com.au.